I can only say that we're truly honored to have such a full house here today. I think Hari would have been truly thrilled that so many people have come together on this occasion, and especially for our very distinguished speaker today. For those who don't know me, I'm Tapati Goatakutta. Hari and I were married for 40 years, but he was my teacher also before that in Calcutta University, and much of my growing up really happened with him. I was in my early 20s when I met him, but he was in his late 20s. So as you would know, soon after returning from Cambridge, after finishing his PhD, and given how long we all took over our PhDs, Hari remembered he had 3 years of money and he had to finish. And in between, he learned the Russian language too. But he said, always told me the best way to finish is when you know your money is running out. I've always told all my PhD students the same since, but I don't think anybody quite managed the speed, etc. So when Hari first returned, he was Delhi-based. He lived in Press Enclave, Saket, with Chaitanya Kalbag, a close friend, journalist friend of his. And his first job was at Ramjas College, courtesy his very good friend, Mushirul Hassan. He then had an offer from St. Stephen's College to teach there, but he also got an offer from a place and a city which he had never visited before, Calcutta University. Professor Amalesh Tripathi, in those days, you didn't need to go through API scores and all that. A lot of things happened on the strength of your reputation, but also conversations. So he was offered a position to teach Russian and European history. And he always said it was an immense opportunity. So everybody in Calcutta was convinced that this Cambridge-educated professor would not come to this place he's never come to before. And the principal of St. Stephen's College was really surprised that Hari did not take up that offer. But he did take this leap in another direction. And it ended up, Calcutta University ended up being his place of professional work. Like Niladri, almost 4 decades in one university. Hari was a very committed teacher, and so that even more than a scholar and a writer, I think his commitment to teaching and to learning, and teaching and learning across a very large field. So my daughter and I had our best lessons, and now realize always at our dining table, when we would have our meals together. So Hari's going was very sudden. It remains a matter of disbelief even 4 years later. It seems he more disappeared than died, because we could not be part of his end, the circumstances being what it was. But it's also interesting how time has moved since, and we're already organizing the 4th annual memorial lecture for Hari. The first 3 were online. The first was given by his very close friend from Christ College, Cambridge, and Russianist Dominic Levin. The second was given by Gayatri Spivak, with whom he worked very closely on a radiating globality project. It was Hari's 70th birthday, Gayatri's 80th. It was a very special lecture. Last year's was given by one of Hari's former student, who's an eminent Russianist at California State University, called Choi Chatterjee. And we're absolutely delighted to have Hari's close friend and mentor, whom he called KK, whom I never had the occasion to meet, but knew a lot about, with whom he worked very closely during his years in Delhi when he was at Jamia on the NCRT project. and I'm sure we'll get to know more about that. But I've just used this occasion to very sincerely thank Professor Krishna Kumar for very readily agreeing to do this lecture in memory of Hari, and for Niladri, a very old friend, to chair this session, because they all worked very closely together on the social sciences section. Niladri was advisor of the history. Hari looked after the social sciences, but I think it was a remarkable moment in educational history. Those textbooks are still widely used. I've had many friends who are teachers, who are not here today, who said it's wonderful because whether or not they're in the syllabus, they remain important points of reference. So that's it. I have 2 slides to show. Just this, which will be up on the screen, but the next one is more important for us. It's my daughter and Hari at the Konark temple. Now, I'm the art historian here, but I think we did a lot of monuments visits together, from Mahabalipuram through Konark. And this photograph came to us, and I thought, well, this is where the history lesson began for him, and possibly this was the youngest student that Hari had. So maybe we'll just have that up on the screen. I'll ask Ravi, my brother-in-law, Hari's brother, Ravi Vasudevan, to come and then say a few words and introduce Niladri.
Good evening. It's wonderful to see such a large gathering of people to remember Hari and to listen to Professor Krishna Kumar today. Seeing Professor Kumar and Niladri together in one place throws me back into the early 2000s because, of course, Hari had this long career in Calcutta, and he went back to that career after a period in Delhi, and a very important period in Delhi, where he was at Jamia Millia Islamia, and he was also looking after my parents who had come to the city. And so it was very much a kind of family reunion of sorts for a period of about 3 years. What that period was bound up with was also not only the excitement of doing things at Jamia Millia Islamia with Mushirul Hasan, who was then Vice Chancellor, but the excitement of the whole textbook enterprise. He was, I think it became part of a kind of lifeblood for him, because even after he left the city, he would be coming back almost once a week, flying in regularly for consultations, for discussions. And it was always KK, as he called him, who would be a reference point. Today, in fact, is my first opportunity to meet the legendary KK. And I'm so pleased that he is actually here to talk in memory of my brother. I did want to say 1 or 2 things about the whole question of children and history, specifically in terms of Hari's personality. Because Hari had a considerable investment in personal history and memory. And childhood was a very critical dimension. And he would continuously be asking friends and family and others about their childhoods, where they grew up, what formed them. And this became a kind of persistent a passion of his to actually pull these kind of memories of the past and of childhood critically out. And this is where, in fact, was the origins of the book, which he actually put together with my mother about her memories, which is out on display in the foyer there. And it was very much a personal oral history, which he actually composed, starting with childhood. But he was formidably, and most family members know this, he was a formidable figure of intergenerational sociality within the family. So it would be nephews and nieces, your peer group, your cousins, your brother, the older folk. Everyone Hari would be visiting with, have serious conversations about. And he was also an inveterate reader of children's fiction, quote unquote, because we know all children's fiction are written by adults. But it's for children. And I remember, so his nephews and nieces, he would be kind of reading Harry Potter with, and whatever the latest thing, which was kind of seizing their kind of imagination or their pleasure, he would be part of it. He was not going to be just this, this intellectual going to the university and perform. He would be part and parcel of the mind of young people. And he was very impatient with me that I hadn't finished the final Harry Potter volume, because he was eager to have a conversation about what that ending was all about. Just a little bit there about the appropriateness, in a peculiar sense, of the topic that Professor Kumar has chosen today on children and history. And I'm so delighted to have Niladri here to chair the session and to introduce Professor Kumar. As Tapu said, they go back decades. They were together when Tapu and Neil were doing PhD and postdoc at that time in Oxford. And a very warm friendship has developed over the years, which was intensified by this very inventive period of the 2000s, when the whole question of teaching children and what it meant came up. So, Niladri.
Chairing today's event with Professor Krishna Kumar giving the fourth Hari Vasudevan Memorial Lecture really makes me feel nostalgic about those 4 years that we spent all together. The exciting 4 years in creating the new curriculum and writing those textbooks, revising those textbooks and writing them. Professor Krishna Kumar, as the director of the NCRT at that time, made it all possible. He created the space for discussions, the space for meetings, and he gave us the freedom. He inspired us, and he gave us the freedom to do the textbooks, devise the textbooks, write the textbooks in the way that we wanted. Hari, as the overall advisor of the social science textbooks, nurtured that collective spirit, which I think is very, very critical for any big collaborative work. Without him, it could not really have happened. The social science project may not have happened in the way that it happened. Hari had an immense capacity to bring people together. Scholars with their individual egos, very often clashing egos, and with their strong opinion and differing, conflicting opinion. To bring them together is not always very easy. And Hari did that with wonderful ease. As an intellectual, Hari had an expansive vision. He was amazingly well-read, and he had the capacity not only to participate in the discussions in the history group, but in every group, political science, economics, sociology, and others. Hari had wonderful people skill. So he could mediate conflicts, hear people out, and very often reconcile opinions which seemed completely irreconcilable. And that's, again, a quality which is necessary if you have to carry 200, 300 people, scholars who are writing, intellectuals who are writing, school teachers, others who are coming together to write these textbooks. In the history, there were about 70 people involved in the writing of those textbooks. So every textbook had 15 to 16 people, with teachers, historians, teachers, NGO workers, everyone coming together. So those years between 2005 and 2009, as has been already mentioned, were extremely exciting, extremely creative and productive times. Professor Kumar is known to everyone here, but I'll recap a few facts about his career. He taught for decades at the Department of Education in Delhi University and was director of the NCRT between 2005 and 2010. He's held fellowships all over the world, at the fellowship at the University of Pennsylvania and the Center for Modern Oriental Studies in Berlin, at the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library. He has been a Shastri Fellow, the Jawaharlal Nehru Fellow, and Erasmus Mundus Fellow. In 2011, he received an honorary delete from the Institute of Education, London, and in the same year, he was awarded the Padma Shri. He is a bilingual author who is published very, very widely. I can't enumerate all his publications, but just to name a few, which I have personally gained a lot from, is The Politics of Education in Colonial India, which was originally published as Agenda for Education. What is Worth Learning, a wonderful book which reflects on what is really worth learning. Prejudice and Pride, Pedagogues, Romance, and Smaller Children, as Smaller Citizens. Raj, Samaj or Shiksha, which is one of his early books in Hindi, a wonderful book. Shiksha or Gyan, Padna, Jada Sochna. KK has reminded us repeatedly that learning for children ought to be an adventure. We need to nurture a sense of excitement and not burden children with an excess of information, a lot of facts, especially in history. The Yashpal committee report, which he co-authored with Yashpal and some others, Learning Without Burden, created the category Learning Without Burden, which is now part of our pedagogic common sense everywhere. Everyone talks of learning without burden, but that was something which KK had formulated along with Yashpal at that time. The question is not just about burden, but the mode of teaching. The theory of pedagogy that KK had nurtured over the years and helped us understand. He was one of the earliest believers in constructionist learning, the idea that teaching has to be interactive, that children should become participants in the production of knowledge. Only then can learning become meaningful and exciting to children. This requires that learning has to be more collaborative than it usually is. It should be more interactive. And the teacher should not appear in the classroom as the upholder of knowledge. He is the knowledge holder, and the students should learn more passively from the teacher as a knowledge. That's the mode of pedagogy which is believed in by people who want to dispense with an ideology, that you do not allow questioning, you do not allow critique. To question is to disobey. And that's part of a different ideology of teaching. Here it is interactive, dialogic, open-ended, and project of learning which becomes exciting for everyone. Related to this was his argument about history. In teaching history, he has repeatedly emphasized in all his writings, I'm not sure what he's going to talk today, that we should not be obsessed with giving a lot of facts to students. The idea that we need to cover a lot of information, cover a range of themes, that's something which we have to dispense with. What is important for students is to learn a sense of history, the capacity to think historically, to ask questions, and begin to think of the world in a historical way. And that competence is what counts, not a knowledge of a whole lot of facts, because there will be debates about facts. That is this important, is that important? And that is important, but it is through those historical facts we learn a sense of history, but debates over what counts as facts, what is worth teaching, will change over time. So we need to rethink, and as KK would say, we need to rethink continuously what really is worth teaching, and what is worth learning, and what is how much to teach, and how to teach that. In memory of Hari Vasudevan, the historian, Professor Kumar has chosen to speak on children and history, which is appropriate. That's something he has been thinking about a lot, and in Hari's memory, that's an appropriate thing to talk about. Professor Kumar.
Professor Niladri Bhattacharya, Professor Tapati Thakurta Guha, Professor Ravi Vasudevan, distinguished esteemed colleagues from different institutions, students, friends. It's more than an honor for me to be invited to deliver the fourth Hari Vasudevan lecture today. The word nostalgia has been used to remind us all what it meant to work with him and actually under his guidance. During my training in this field of educational theory, I had learnt from several of my teachers that curriculum designing is actually a matter of deliberation. Now, this word deliberation had been used by several theorists in the Western world, but its actual meaning became clear to me when I saw Hari Vasudevan in action, chairing meetings of 40, 50 people in the social science group and making everyone feel recognized so that they would feel comfortable talking about what they thought a curriculum is, should be, and what we might do now that we are facing this task of creating a curriculum which will shape the syllabus, which will shape the textbooks in the social sciences. In that sense, Hari Vasudevan made me realize what deliberation is. The other day we were looking up the origin of this word, and it's undoubtedly an interesting word in the history of English language. Comes from libera in its origin, which suggests balance. And that is precisely the art I saw being practiced in those meetings that Hari Vasudevan chaired. We had a number of sort of common things between us, including our age. And when we lost him, I actually had to check with two friends in Calcutta whether this was a rumor or was it really true. It was very difficult to believe that, as was mentioned just now, that he simply disappeared. Both of us were teachers, with the difference that he was a teacher of history and I was a teacher of education. Now, if you are a teacher of education, people always ask you, who do you teach? And as it turns out, in the case of educational theory as a field just doesn't count. And if you say you teach teachers, then people feel a bit sorry for you. Those who can do, Liam Hudson had said. Those who can't teach. Those who can't teach teachers. And those who can't teach teachers do educational research. This is a very famous Scottish psychologist writing in his book about contrary imaginations. I'm sure Hari faced some exciting questions from his teachers all his life. In my case, it was always the kind of questions that teachers under training ask. How to questions. How to teach this. And somehow teacher training gets reduced to the craft of teaching. You rarely face conceptual questions for clarity of an idea or a theory or the history of the evolution of this idea. You rarely face those. So questions in my life as a teacher were rather, you can say, simpler by Hari's standards. But we sometimes talked about these differences between disciplines and what kinds of questions emerge from there. I mean, many of you knew Hari throughout your life and careers. For me, he was a sudden discovery made thanks to Professor Narayani Gupta, who is here, who changed so much in my practice of this field. Otherwise, education as a field to teach in is relatively tepid, precisely because of the kind of questions that you face as a teacher. But a few years ago, I was stumped by a question asked by a teacher. She teaches in a government school in Haryana, and she had come to attend a conference about 4 years ago. And after the usual sermon that I give was over, which has been summarized by Niladri about my ideas about teaching, she stood up and played a little video. The video said in sort of very clear, loud voice, along with an image, India's first nuclear explosion took place 2,000 years ago. Here is the picture. And everybody saw the mushroom cloud. This teacher's question was, sir, how should I convince this child that what he has seen on this video is not true? Now, this was a very difficult question, not just because of circumstances, but in reality, it's a very difficult question. In popular discourse of childhood, children of all ages, including teenage, are believed to be impressionable. Indeed, the entire spectrum of childhood, which we, those who work in education, like to divide into parts, is believed to be impressionable all the way. Now, this child, apparently, his impression had been made. An imprint had been made by a very powerful medium in grade 6. And the teacher's question was, is there some hope that I can actually dispel this impression and prove to the child that what he has learned from this video is not correct? And what she will teach or what the textbook will say, I don't know what they all said in Haryana, will be more true. This competition between truths is what she was talking about. And I thought this was a genuine question, not the kind of questions that I have faced in my career teaching teachers or would-be teachers, which are simpler questions. I think she was touching on a problem with the manner in which children learn about the past. The past is a very peculiar object of learning during childhood, compared to language or compared to learning in science. And the reason is quite obvious. Language comes to the child, if you believe modern linguists, from birth. And as for science, it comes from child's own experience fairly early. The child sees the sunrise, the sunset, change of seasons, and so on. And even a 2 or 3-year-old is aware of so many things which in later childhood can serve as the edifice of learning science. Because the child observes, experiences, and in quite a few cases, children's curiosity about nature rises from within. And that leads to the possibility of science coming to the child from as if partly from inside and only partly from somebody who knows science or from a book. None of this is true about the past. Not that the past doesn't leave any traces. It does. It leaves traces everywhere. But these traces are not sufficient in themselves to attract the child's attention. In fact, even the past that an old watch, which a grandfather might have left behind, will have to be brought into life by somebody in the family. And this is where the past acquires a different meaning for children, that it requires a mediator. Right from the beginning, it requires a mediator to bring it alive. And this is a very crucial aspect of the distinction between the subject that deals with the past and other subjects that are part of the school curriculum. Learning in the case of the past and learning in the case of these other subjects acquires a very different, not only connotation, but substance. Their meaning differs. And this is something that does require considerable reflection and the kind of research that has just begun to be done. How do children acquire a sense of the past? The past waits in many ways as the child proceeds through this long process of maturation. In the early period, if you look at it from a purely cognitive psychological background, it must wait for mathematical concepts to emerge and become reasonably substantial before a sense of time, let alone a scale of time, can make sense to a child. What is known as logico-mathematical thinking in cognitive psychology takes a considerable amount of activities, experiences, and maturation simply. Nature's calendar cannot be compressed. Any decent psychologist will tell you. No matter how hard we work in kindergartens and schools, our hard work is actually quite not only silly, but can be quite negative in its consequences. Maturation has no substitute. And a sense of time, especially a sense of time that can take into account before and after, and the possibility of reversibility, understanding what happened before this and therefore was not affected by what happened later. This is a very, very complex issue for the growing child's mind. And it must wait if we are talking about past in the sense of something that can be understood in a way that makes sense to the learner. At the same time, it's true that the child is surrounded by not only traces of the past, but the past that has been assimilated in tradition. It's a part of being in the family, in the community, in any space. It's a part of that to be exposed to the manner in which culture has absorbed its long past. In visits to a temple, visits to a church, visits to a village fair, visits of various kinds in the child's acculturation, as we call it in sociology, visits with parents, visits with other members of the family, they all create a sense of something that happened long, long ago. Now, did it actually happen? Or is this a residue of things which are not available to us in an analytical sense? I mean, Lord Krishna's life with Yashoda, or what poets sing about, how a Durga Puja festival presents to us so many aspects of a very attractive, fascinating kind of cultural tradition. All of that is absorbed by the small child, and it creates a sense of a long past without the child being necessarily aware that all this is past. Past in the sense that it can be made sense of. Instead, it's something that conveys a kind of intuitive history, one might call it, that all this must have happened sometime long time back, that my mother still is so interested in it. A Gauri Puja festival does require us sometimes to explain, and this explanation is not really an explanation in the cognitive sense. It's an attempt to make the child somewhat more pleased with the fact that he knows what all is going on around and why people are so excited and so happy about it and so on. But this is at best a kind of an intuitive history. It's not history. For that to make sense to a child, maturation requires that child to be coming close to adolescence, actually. Not even early adolescence is enough for that. The little child needs to become a full-fledged adolescent, and in many cases a teenager, to recognize that things have happened before his life, things that have made his life what it is, different, things that are very consequential to the world that he has suddenly realized is this sense of thisness that a 14 or 15-year-old suddenly requires to recognize is often a very daunting experience for the adolescent. This is because both the cognitive and the emotional aspects of maturation sort of come together at this point. You realize as an adolescent that much has happened which I can't actually even touch, undo, or make sense of. How could this have happened before me? Which is so decisive. And quite a few adolescents get very, very upset with the fact that there's so little left in the world to do that is positive, constructive, exciting. For many today, in the third generation of partition's children, it's still that kind of experience. How did you allow it to happen, Grandpa? It's a question you still hear in partition memories, partition suffering families, and so on. It's a difficult realization that the world had already taken a decisive shape before I was around, and there is very little that I can do about it. The sort of cliche idea that an adolescent is an idealist gets a very serious challenge on account of this realization that yes, the reality is now constructed. The world is a stable construction in which logico-mathematical ideas can be applied on a fairly in a free manner. And so the world is cognizable, analyzable, understandable in many ways. And at the same time, it's a world that looks so closed, that so many things are now doomed. Very many teenagers use that word. That it seems it's just doomed, What can you do with these kinds of things that have happened before? Whether it's a war or whether it's a displacement or other forms of destruction that have happened before, the adolescent mind takes time to absorb it without his or her idealism getting shattered. And that is really the meaning of this experience of developing a kind of notion of the self, which has been growing, of course, all along through the primary socialization of the early years, the intuitive history, I belong to this community or I'm a member of that family. That kind of identity now faces its most difficult challenge of seeing this is who I am. And by that time, there is a bit of a past for the adolescent to mull over in her own life. It's an individual past, which carries the shadow of a much, much longer past, which becomes available to the child by now from various sources, but which is a very a sort of a daunting sense that I have to live in a world in which just about every direction I see something terrible has already happened, and now I'm around to see what I can do about it or can do about it. The excitement of adolescence has this paradoxical character, that there is great energy, great idealism, great desire to engage with the world, and at the same time this deep realization that the past has shaped things in a certain definitive manner for my life, the life in which I have to lead under these circumstances. They have been shaped. So the challenge of the school, which attempts to teach a history, which consists of quote unquote facts, this challenge becomes very real if you want education to make sense rather than to simply learn about things. This notion that one's own experience is not enough, that somebody who is credible, who can be trusted, is telling me about what happened long ago, is a very important aspect of learning history. Let's take a moment to realize, what does it mean to know history if you have learned it? Even as an adult, especially if you didn't like history in childhood, and yet history is there and you know a little bit about it. What does it mean to say, I know what happened here? Well, there are three very clearly distinguished meanings one can draw here. One is to know history in the sense of being acquainted. That I know Ashoka the Great. He ruled from this year to that, and Patliputra was his capital, and so on. To know in that sense of being acquainted with names, dates, spaces, and the long past of either India or the world. To know in the sense of being acquainted. And have enough of that kind of knowledge to share in conversations or to sort of make sense of somebody's speech or a film and so on. this is the most common way in which one can say the knowledge of history makes people think they know it. Then there's a second meaning which sometimes people use and invoke, and that is they have something in their imagination, lodged in their imagination, a certain idea of what happened long, long ago. That this is the way in which it probably happened in the 17th century. Or this is the manner in which a certain building came up. Ability to visualize a past moment from long ago past or recent past. This is another meaning which has become quite popular, I would say, as a result of this very powerful medium of our times, the cinema, its inheritor, the television, and now videos and so on and so forth. The sense in which I can imagine it. In fact, teachers quite often like to turn historical episodes into literary kind of drama. And quite a few teachers believe that this is the way to learn history better, by bringing it alive and making us feel as if it's happening right now. Now, it's a double-edged sword, of course, pedagogically, but if it comes too alive and arouses the same emotions that it might have aroused according to your projection at the time at which it occurred, then it's really not doing great service to history. And yet, visualization is considered one approach to live teaching of history, against which many good history pedagogues have warned. Yes, bring it alive, but not too alive, please. Because after all, it is history. And it won't be very good if you make it feel as if it happened yesterday. And time scale, yes, it has stabilized by the time you are doing it in grade 11 or 12. But time scales are often quite flexible when emotions get involved in looking at distant pasts or closer pasts and so on and so forth. And then there is a third meaning. When people say, I know history or I understand history, that third meaning is very important, that I can figure it out. I can figure out today, for example, many people say, why Gandhi has suddenly become so unpopular. Or I can figure out what might have happened in the early period of British rule. When they say, I know that, they actually mean that I can make sense of that. What colonialism might have done to the Indian economy. I can believe it, I can figure it out, because this is what that period or the British rule over India or elsewhere was all about. And therefore I understand that there must have been exploitation, there must have been construction of railways must have led to this or that, and so on. All these paradoxes become somewhat palpable and understandable in this third sense of knowing history. And actually, as you can very easily imagine, this is really the domain of education in history. How to encourage people to figure out, how to encourage children to figure out what happened in the past in an analytical sense. And this is where I think three problems crop up for institutions dealing with children. Whether these are schools or whether these are media institutions, NGOs, or anybody who attempts to bring some order in the teaching and learning of history has to kind of recognize or realize that there are these three key issues. One is, what do you do with the intuitive history that the child came with? Typically, educational institutions do not recognize that intuitive history. Educational institutions, even if they start very early, feel that real education starts now, and they feel as if the child has actually come as a clean slate for us to write on conveniently. Nowadays they don't write on slates, but the metaphor has survived the e-slates. And this idea that primary socialization has already created attitudes, beliefs, hatreds and loves, that all this has happened before the child showed up at the school. Even in a kindergarten, the first 3 years, 4 years were the most crucial, critical years of childhood. Schools don't recognize that. They feel that the layer that they are here to create on the child's mind is a fresh layer, and once this sedimentary rock has received this layer, the lower layers will either become a separate entity for the learned child, or that they will somehow remain in hiding or disappear. It's rarely understood that these two are actually very, very tightly interwoven, and what has been internalized and assimilated in primary socialization of the very early years is far more deeply entrenched and more firmly entrenched than anything that can be taught by even the best of methods. And in sociology we call it secondary socialization. Is actually secondary in that sense, because it doesn't do much to that rock of primary understanding of things. So this is one problem out of the three that I wanted to discuss, for this idea that now history can be known to the child. The second problem that we need to make sense of, we need to recognize in this way, is the idea that what needs to be learned now is a very different kind of learning, and it uses the kinds of instruments that maturation creates. Part of this problem arises because history starts too early. In grade 6, age 11, when it typically starts in most parts of our country and many parts of the world as well, is hardly the time when time scales have become stable, when things can make sense. But in many cases, like in Maharashtra, for example, Shivaji as a historical figure is taught in grade 4. Which is so much earlier, and in some schools in Maharashtra you can even see it in grade 3. This idea that somehow children will make sense if it's taught well, with good textbooks or with good teachers, will become knowledge in that real sense, is still a very difficult idea to accept if you think about children as children. In fact, it's not very different from how geography is introduced. Long before a child knows how maps are made, the child sees maps on a scale that is quite incredible. Not just India, but Asia and the world and so on. What does it mean to show such vast territories on a little stamp or on the blackboard? Maps don't make any sense at all till a certain amount of work has been done on understanding the idea of scale. And even after that, if experience of making a map of, let's say, this room or the school's surroundings, unless that experience has been gone through several times, the notion that a map on piece of paper can actually show a vast country or the whole world is nothing less than a fantasy. And yet, yes, it's part of knowledge, and the kind of knowledge it is not even not even acquaintance with the world. It's simply a word. And there's so much knowledge that actually remains at the word level. Little children use terms like, I know it happened this happened because of that. They don't know what because means, because causality hasn't taken place. And yet language deceives us into thinking that the child understands. And nowadays, of course, the new cult of enlightened parenthood is that we must explain everything to the child. Give the child the opportunity to take a view or to decide on a significant matter that the family is considering. These ideas are, of course, very good to consider, and in some circles they are regarded as progressive ideas, but they do create a serious problem when we begin to understand how children make sense of the world. So history in grade 4 or grade 6 does fall into this very problematic terrain, that it has to be learned. In fact, exams have to be gone through, and yet it doesn't make much sense. That sense making has to wait for a longer period. I think one quite stunning experience that the late Professor Yashpal and I had when we were traveling around the country for that burden report. We visited a kindergarten in Kerala, and that day the children were being taught that India became independent in 1947. And Yashpal was very keen to know from the teachers, does this 1947, have they learnt these many numbers already at age 4? And do they know the meaning of independence? And what do they think about India? And how did it become independent? And the teachers said, this is very good for them to know because we celebrate Independence Day. And this notion that somehow these little children will understand what all that was at that point was entertained quite pleasantly. And it's true not just of that particular teacher in Kerala, this is a general feeling about it. The third problem comes from the discipline of history itself. The discipline of history is structured around the idea that what happened first, or what we know about happened first, must come first. So history is from the most backward point in time scale to the present. And therefore, if teaching of history is organized as on sort of an academic principle in schools, then it inevitably must start with ancient times and come up to the modern times from that. Now, I suppose this is not realized as a problem in the way history is organized for schools, because child psychology is the last thing that historians are going to worry about. If they are in charge of presenting their discipline to school education. In earlier days, the whole of history had to be taught. Now, of course, nowadays we are teaching less than that, and even that less is getting further mutilated. So the problem is probably going to remain in that ancient to modern, and yet become even more complex for us to deal with. So this is the third issue. How do you make history presented in a way that it makes sense to a child at school? I would like to I'd like to lead you into the third section of this lecture by trying to imagine people who don't get that good an opportunity to study history as such at school, especially not up to the time when they became teenagers and could make sense of it, that is in grades 9, 10, 11, 12, and so on. What happens to all these people who only had some exposure to history by grade 8? And then that was the end of history in a way. In fact, quite often events like Gandhi's assassination come in that period, and very often they are not covered at all by either history of the freedom struggle or history of modern India. They fall somewhere in between. And in many cases, these are episodes of history that are actually very problematic from the point of view of our earlier discussion about adolescence and how the adolescent receives this knowledge of the past before his life, having decided so many contours of life. Quite often this, as I said to you earlier, this realization is very difficult. For so many people in my generation, learning about the fact that Gandhi was no more around in the 50s was itself quite a sort of a difficult news, because we had raised slogans about Mahatma Gandhi ki jai, Bharat Mata ki jai, Pandit Nehru ki jai, and so on, before realizing that Gandhi was not around. And then to realize that Gandhi was actually murdered, realizing that around the time that we were able to distinguish between death and murder was not simple. And many of that generation still find it difficult how we cope with the idea of a nation whose father was murdered. And these issues get very entangled with inadequate learning about the past at a time when it might have or would have made sense, could have made sense. These issues have become even more compounded today for a variety of reasons, including the reason that the teacher is not the only source of history anymore. History comes to children in schools and colleges through so many other resources. And some of this history can be very problematic. Certainly it hasn't gone through any processes of deliberation of the kind that we were discussing earlier in the context of how Hari Vasudevan dealt with syllabus making as a process of deliberation among people from different disciplines who would have a reason to bring in this from history and that from political science and a third factor from economics and so on and so forth. The processes that go into the making of historical movies, for instance, those processes are very, very problematic. Certainly, they are totally disproportionate in their preparation to the impact they make or the consequence that they have for a vast population. This vast population must live with what I call memory posters of sorts, colorful posters of a past that came to them either through primary socialization in early childhood or came in films and or simply other means that they could imagine what this word means, how leaders of Indian freedom struggle fought with the British. What does it mean that they fought? In a memory poster, it would look like a real, a sort of a battle where some of these leaders were standing and were lathi charged and then put into jails and so on and so forth. And various other episodes acquire this kind of memory poster sort of existence. The thing about memory posters is that they always hang free of a time scale. They hang free in the mind's firmament, and they can be used to mobilize support. History, in that sense, walks into an ideological conflict in several countries of the world. We have seen this phenomena, we have seen it in our country as well. And with the advent of the digital age, this issue has taken a far more complex and grim meaning, because custodians have been pushed aside by the powers of the digital industry. Custodians like parents who might want to pursue a saner approach to learning. Teachers have certainly been pushed aside. In fact, quite often now, administrators of education themselves push aside teachers by assigning a certain content provider the task of creating content for different subjects. This is happening even in colleges and universities. And therefore the child, the young person is in that sense quite unprotected now, has been handed over to larger commercial forces, political forces, and so on. So the problem of what shall we tell our children a perennial problem for adult human beings about what happened before they were born remains. I'm reminded of the late Professor Ravinder Kumar's advice to me. This was 1998, when I was working on a book which attempted to compare how history of the freedom struggle is taught in Indian schools with how it's taught in Pakistani schools. I was about to visit Pakistan for the first time, specifically to Lahore. And since Ravinder Kumar had written so much about Lahore, I thought I must see him before I go. And we had a very nice half-hour discussion, at the end of which he said, Krishna, no matter what you learn there from children or teachers, do remember that nobody likes to tell children that our forefathers were crooks or that they were stupid and so on. And I thought that advice is so meaningful. No matter where you stand in a conflict-ridden nation like, let's say, modern Israel, or several other countries that have gone through the trauma of having their populations divided into rival factions, this issue of what shall we tell our children has to go through the structures of power. In order to become knowledge, it has to become official knowledge. And that is where modern education faces its most difficult challenge. Can official knowledge also be true? And what does knowledge mean when, no matter what the official knowledge is or how far one can push it towards the truth, as Hari Vasudevan, Niladri, and so many other people tried to do in the early 2000s, no matter how much effort you make to penetrate this shell of official knowledge, to make it somewhere, bring it somewhere closer to a debatable truth, sometimes a paradoxical truth, ambivalent truth. No matter how hard you try, you still today face a different world altogether, thanks to the new technology of communication and creation of knowledge. Technology is no more a medium of communication or transmission of knowledge as it was in the age of the radio or in the age of television. Today, it's actually a parallel process. The word construction of knowledge was used by Niladri earlier today. The idea that children construct knowledge with the help of resources that they must discover, find out, requires, of course, a number of other conditions, including the condition that their curiosity needs to be cultivated on a considerably long scale before they can begin to distinguish between sense and nonsense, before they have the mental tools of making such distinctions. And that curiosity cultivation, especially about the past, which, as I said to you earlier, requires a mediator, and it's a very slow and painstaking process. Inevitably, it requires helping children to maintain their freedom, at the same time accept the guidance of somebody who they can trust, to make sense of things around them. Those of us who were involved in this process in the early 2000s thought that local knowledge of history of the local was a very important means of cultivating this. A few non-government organizations in the country had already begun some work in that direction, that the child needs to become sufficiently capable of using the means of what historians use in a more advanced sense in this earlier period, when the child's attention is being drawn by traces of the past around where the child lives, around where the school is. And once those means of making sense of that come to a point where the child begins to see what historians actually do, then history will make far greater sense when they learn it in school. Because historians are not dealing with past in the sense in which an adolescent has an individual past or a family has the past of the family. They are dealing with a collective history. Historians are in the business of creating collective consciousness at an impressionable age, to use that word, which I don't like much, because adults too today are very impressionable. But the point that history requires this prolonged cultivation through the first decade of life, up to at least the age of 10, 11, 12, for history to begin to make sense if it comes after that in a seriously conceptualized curriculum of history for schools. That poses a very difficult task for a country like India. In fact, those of us who were at that time involved in this process were charged by several historians of great eminence that if we introduce local knowledge, we are opening the door too wide for all kinds of misuses of history. At that time, yes, we were worried about misuse of history. But now one begins to worry about history itself. What will happen to history? What will happen to history which has used reasonably well-researched museums for such a long time for a child or teacher to visit and see what evidence the past has left? What will happen to history when evidence itself becomes a very debatable category, flimsy category, available for political use in the free market of videos and texts? Remember, in the digital mode, every text looks absolutely neat like a book. There is no trace of somebody's cursive or bad handwriting when a message comes on WhatsApp. It's as good as print. And the same is true of video. A video made in a corner of a park is just as shiny and clear as a serious documentary made about some older past. In this, therefore, context, we worry about what will we tell our children and what kind of history we will own in order to tell or teach our children. Thank you.
Thanks, Professor Kumar, for that wonderfully thoughtful lecture. A whole range of nuanced points have been raised. And just, to me, what 2 or 3 points appeared extremely important. One is, of course, the idea, which Professor Kumar has made in many other places also, that the notion of time for a child develops in a way we need to fathom, we need to understand. As teachers, as pedagogues, as then textbook writers, we really need to understand how a child learns about the past and the notion of time, which is necessary to learn about the past. The second and related point that he's made today, and he's reflected deeply on that, is how the early notion, in early years, the notion of the past that comes to the child is primarily through myths, stories, and legends. So you have a notion of an abstract, fuzzy, long past without it being a chronologically datable past. So you know about the long past and the present. That's the way you learn history, and it requires adolescence and a maturity over time to get to a stage where you can begin to think of chronology in a certain sense. That doesn't make sense to children of early years. And the notion of history at that time, I thought the way he captured the argument is extremely important. That is, history has to be understood as making sense, figuring it out. When you begin to figure it out, then you understand history. It's not just learning a set of facts, it's about understanding what colonialism was, how figuring it out, how partition happened, what national movement was. So that sense of figuring out or making sense is what history is all about. Again, this helps us understand how this kind of a notion helps us think of a history which is not a burden for children. It is something which makes them think, how to figure out. But he went on to talk about a whole range of things, which I think is the cause of anxiety amongst all of us. How do you tell not just children but adults that what you have seen is not true? How do you persuade people in a digital age where the repetitiveness with which certain things circulate and the power of the persuasive power of the digital media makes people believe what you read and what you see becomes truth? In such an age where the truth is being continuously produced and reproduced in a variety of through the social media, what is it to how do we claim the truth of the past? How do we claim this is true and this is not true? It's not something on which we can immediately give an answer, but it is a cause not only of concern but a deep worry. And that's the sense of worry that Professor Kumar was talking about. It's a situation where the traditional mediators of history, the sense of history you get from home, the sense of history you get through the teachers in the schools and colleges or by historians, that all that mediation is in some sense being displaced. The historical profession in some sense is under threat and attack. In such a situation, what is it? How do we persuade children to think about history over time? Also becomes a question, how do we persuade adults to think of history in a certain sense in the age that we are living in? We'll take some questions.
Would you like to?
Sure, there's time.
5-10 minutes.
Maybe just 2 or 3
So
questions.
the floor is open. We'll take a few questions, but we'll take them collectively, not one by one. 2 or 3 questions together, then we can answer them. Yes?
You know, Professor Krishna Kumar's excellent lecture just reminded me of a poem written by Safdar Hashmi, How Children View Azadi. Now, every 15th August, 15th August is a holiday, every 13th August, every school celebrates our Independence Day. And Safdar Hashmi's poem, I wish to share with everyone. It says, लाल किले के बाग में आज़ादी का मेला, सबसे ऊपर नाच रहा है झंडा एक अकेला, कदम बढ़ाते बैंड बजाते फौजी आते जाते, वहीं बैठकर बच्चे बूढ़े चने मुरमुरे खाते. कहते हैं कि आज के दिन आज़ाद हुआ था देश, आज के ही दिन अंग्रेज़ों का राज हुआ था शेष. अपनी तो कुछ समझ ना आती आज़ादी क्या देश, हम तो छत से देख रहे हैं पतंग पतंग के पेंच. हमसे अगर पूछे कोई आज़ादी क्या होती, हम तो झट से कहेंगे उस दिन पूरी छुट्टी होती.
सर, एक आंशिक असहमति है और एक सवाल है. आंशिक असहमति ये है कि जब आपने कहा कि पूर्वजों को लेकर ग्लानि का भाव शायद लोग नहीं चाहते हैं, मगर हम देख रहे हैं कनाडा, ऑस्ट्रेलिया और शायद भारत में भी जाति और लैंगिक विमर्श के संदर्भ में वो शायद ऐसा नहीं है पूरी तरह से. लोग सवाल खड़े करते हैं अपने पूर्वजों पे भी. और सवाल ये है मेरा, ये मेरी क्लास की छात्रा, पहली क्लास की छात्रा का एक कमेंट था 30 जनवरी के आसपास. तो उसने कहा गांधी जी को तो गोली मारी थी क्योंकि वो पाकिस्तान को पैसे देने की बात कर रहे थे. तो ये पहली क्लास की छात्रा है नगर निगम स्कूल की. तो मेरा सवाल ये है कि क्या वो तथ्य तो नहीं है मगर वो भावनाएं शायद जो घरों से और पड़ोस से लेकर इतिहास का बोध एक विद्यार्थी छात्राएं आ रही हैं, तो क्या एज टीचर्स हम लोग वैकल्पिक भावनाएं खड़ी करें या उनको हम इंटरोगेट करें जिन तथ्यों जिन भावनाओं के साथ वो आ रहे हैं?
मेरा भी जो सवाल है फिरोज भाई का ही सवाल है, और वो सवाल ये है कि आज की डेट के अंदर हम टीचर्स के लिए चैलेंज ये नहीं कि हम कैसे फैसिलिटेट करें कि बच्चे हिस्ट्री को सीखें, कंस्ट्रक्ट करें, बल्कि आज चैलेंज ये हो गया कि हम स्टूडेंट को फैसिलिटेट किस तरह से करें कि वो जो सीख कर आए हैं उसको डिस्ट्रॉय कैसे करें. हाउ वी फैसिलिटेट स्टूडेंट टू डिस्ट्रॉय दे ऑलरेडी लर्न. जो ये नॉलेज क्रिएशन हो रहा है सोशल मीडिया एंड अदर.
Sir, my question is, do children in conflict-ridden areas also acquire this sense of history the same way as, say, children like us who are living in a relatively safer environment.
I recall you mentioning this business about the child having a sense of time before he arrives at a sense of history. But the thing is, when we're talking about how history can be relevant in a very everyday way, is there a way in which we can explain to children the fact that just 3 minutes back is also history? At what age do you think the child also has a sense that history is as recent as that? I don't know, do psychologists in fact have a sense of that, or educationists? So that's basically my question. And so that makes it in some sense much more relevant and closer to my time, even though the textbooks will of course talk about things that happened several years back, but actually there's history constantly being made as I'm living through it.
जो पहला सवाल आया था कि पहली क्लास के बच्चों को क्या बताएं, और दूसरा सवाल भी उससे मिलता ही जुलता था कि जो उन्होंने सीखा है क्या उसको हम पहले डिस्ट्रॉय ना करें. अंग्रेज़ी में भी इस तरह के शब्द इस्तेमाल होते रहे हैं कि फर्स्ट यू हैव टू अनलर्न व्हाट यू हैव लर्नड. देयर इज़ नो सच थिंग. जो सीख लिया है, अब वो किस स्तर पे है, सीखने का क्या मतलब हुआ है, क्या वो इस्तेमाल हो रहा है चीज़ों को और ज़्यादा समझने के लिए, या वो एक तरह का विमर्श बन के जम चुका है. आप उसको इस तरह से आसानी से, जिसको हम कहते हैं डिस्ट्रॉय, जो आपने शब्द इस्तेमाल किया, वो संभव नहीं. वो केवल हमारी फैंटेसी है. हम जो कि बच्चों का बचपन वापस उनको देना चाहने की बात करते हैं, कई NGOs ऐसा करते हैं, कई और लोग भी इस तरह से बात करते हैं, वो संभव नहीं होता है, वास्तव में नहीं होता है. लेकिन वो हमें एक तरह से संतुष्ट करता है ये विचार कि जो नुकसान हुआ है हम उसकी भरपाई कर देंगे, या हम उसकी जगह कुछ और स्थापित कर देंगे बच्चे के दिमाग में. ये कहने में बड़ी अच्छी बात है, पर ज़्यादा से ज़्यादा आप यही कर सकते हैं कि आप एक डिस्कोर्स की जगह एक दूसरा डिस्कोर्स स्थापित कर दें और बच्चे फिर आपकी तरह बोलने लगें. ये एक ख़ासियत बच्चों में होती है कि वो हर परिस्थिति में ज़िंदा रहना जानते हैं. एक तरह की सर्वाइवल इंस्टिंक्ट बच्चों में होती है, और इसलिए जब आप पाठ्यक्रम बदलते हैं, बहुत बड़े बड़े परिवर्तन होते हैं, तो पहले टीचर्स एकदम एडजस्ट कर लेते हैं अपने आप को उससे, और बच्चे फिर आसानी से एडजस्ट कर लेते हैं. ये हम लोग जानते हैं कि इन परिवर्तन के इन दौरों में टीचर की कोई आवाज़ हमारे देश में वैसे भी नहीं सुनी जाती, उसमें भी नहीं सुनी जाती, उन दौरों में भी नहीं सुनी जाती, और यही बच्चों की स्थिति है. तो ये इस पर सोचने की ज़रूरत है कि क्या हमारे थोड़े से प्रयास से कोई पहले सीखा हुआ विचार ख़त्म कर दिया जा सकता है, क्योंकि विचारों की लड़ाई ही शायद वैचारिक जीवन के लिए एक आवश्यक शर्त है. आप एक विचार को नष्ट करके दूसरा विचार पैदा कर दें, पहले अव्वल तो ये संभव नहीं है, क्योंकि वो विचार भी कहीं ना कहीं तो रहेगा, और जब जलवायु उपयुक्त होगी तो उसमें खिलेगा, लहलहाएगा. ये हम जानते हैं वैचारिक इतिहास का एक पहलू है. तो इस पर सोचने की बहुत ज़्यादा ज़रूरत है. और एक सवाल उसके जो बाद आया है वो है कॉन्फ्लिक्ट रिडन एरियाज. आई थिंक दैट्स अ वेरी डिफ़िकल्ट क्वेश्चन टू आंसर, एंड आई डोंट थिंक एनीवन हैज़ द आंसर. हाउ, so for example, today's Palestinian children in this horrible conflict, how do they make sense of it? I think the more important question is how they will make sense of it later, say 5 years from now. This idea that something can be destroyed entirely means a lot of children will die, but many will survive. And if you go by the famous Jewish philosopher Kaneti, any experience of violence during childhood inevitably creates the desire for avenging it in later life. One of our students in CIE has worked on children's responses to the conflict in Nepal, and you may find his book, which is now published by Routledge, useful to answer this question, or at least to get some insight in this question. Quite similarly, people have worked on how children have
who have grown up during the late 80s, 90s in Kashmir. How did they internalize and make sense of it? Very recently, a doctoral study has been completed on this subject, and the answer it gives to your question is that they are deeply injured by the conflict that they have lived through, and they try to find answers to why it happened and so on. And the system of education, teachers and others are find it quite difficult to provide answers that might satisfy them now that they are older children. So memories of having lived through a conflict-ridden zone continue to remain alive and continue to pose issues. I mean, the partition memories, for example, are far from settled today in that sense, in families, communities, both here and across the border. Dr. Vijay Lakshmi worked on children of partition as a very serious piece of work, and she also comes to this kind of conclusion that the best we can do in such cases is to create an accommodative enough discourse where paradoxical views, where contradictory ideas can both be heard and understood, whose logic is what, in order to create a situation where you stop living in that history. Instead, you learn to live with it. I mean, partition can't be undone, except, there are people who believe it can be or should be. But there are all kinds of beliefs in the world, including this one. But partition has to be lived with, instead of thinking that it doomed every chance of peace and so on and so forth. That applies to so many other societies where this politics of making people feel more at home in the past and use the past to create a fake future, where this kind of political effort continues to be made. I think in such societies or such situations, we need to take into account the idea of why do we learn about the past when the past is over and dead. Its meaning gives us a very unusual kind of opportunity to hone our curiosity and our intellectual skills to make sense of it. That is ultimately the pleasure of learning history. If we can get to that point or create that pleasure in classrooms, in our interaction with children, then we have done it. We have achieved something. That the past provides us a different kind of experience of enjoying the pleasure of satisfying curiosity, different from, let's say, science or mathematics. These are all enterprises of curiosity, ultimately. How we satisfy that curiosity without feeling charged with emotion to do something about it now. That will be a very poor outcome of education. I think there was another question at the end. What was it?
Living history as it's lived.
No, 3 minutes ago history. Many countries have laws which don't allow things that happened less than 25 years ago to be taught as history, and sensibly so. And in our own context, we can see that post-independence period of India's past has not yet properly entered the history syllabus. It has entered in the enterprise of NCERT, the political science syllabus, yes, so that political events are remembered. But history in the broader sense of understanding society, understanding the human condition in certain periods, I think does require more than 3 minutes to be remembered as history. History is something that we need to be able to talk about without immediately getting excited. So excited that we are ready to pounce each other as to you did this to me. You are reminded of a Charlie Chaplin silent film where one of the characters hits somebody who's speaking, and after he has finished his point, he says, "You hit me?" He said, "You didn't do anything about it at that time." So now it's too late to do something about it. I request you to reconsider this 3-minute metaphor. It's not history. This is life, you can say. But for history for the past to become historically available, for historical investigation, it has to settle in certain ways before it can be brought into the domain of discourse, discussion, debates, and so on.
I think it's been a really wonderful, thought-provoking lecture with many more questions that will come. I'd just like to end on a very brief note, not by thanking Professor Kumar and Niladri, but also to say this question of how much of damage can be undone is a huge question, because history is about both prejudice and pride, and therefore it is a problem. But I do believe that there could be a larger civic responsibility, and I say civic because, and it has to be in a mode of counter-persuasion, not about being didactic. To say that, yes, you may have been taught something, you may have read something, but there are other stories too. And I think that becomes an issue, that take them to a mosque and say it wasn't necessarily always a temple. Or, tell them about a figure who may be being wiped out entirely. So I feel that if it is in the mode of persuasion and storytelling, it could be about conflicting voices. But children, as you say, learn to live with conflict as much as they learn to live with a sense of great heritage and pride. And therefore not to erase the conflicts in our past may be one way of thinking. But I do believe that the more history disappears as we've known it, the more it becomes a collective responsibility to keep telling counter stories, take people on other journeys in the smallest way possible. And I think as all of us who were trained in the discipline realize, evidence is such a shaky ground, but persuasion and other kinds of stories often carry a long way. So on that note, I'd like to really thank both of you for a wonderful session, and ask Mrinalini, our daughter, to come and give you 2 small token of thanks on our behalf.